I just want to preface this video with a spoiler warning. 1000 times resist casts a very broad net, so it's almost impossible that I spoil everything for you, but if you plan on playing this at all, I would suggest that you do so first and then come back to this video afterwards. As per the title of this video, I'm also going to talk about some pretty grisly stuff, so if you aren't up for that, you know what to do. What does it mean to leave one's homeland? It's a question that many struggle with, a question my family and many other families from all over the world have come to terms with as they upend their lives and move to greener pastures, be it to escape war, political unrest, or the harsh hand of certain governments. So when I played 1000 times resist and found it to home in on this idea with unmatched precision, I was definitely intrigued. You see, it's not just a personal story regarding an Asian family fleeing Hong Kong after the 2019 demonstrations, but also a tale of a society comprised entirely of clones of an immortal teenage girl. Yeah, you heard me. The debut title from Vancouver-based Sunset Visitor is only ostensibly about those clones, the result of a government operation with the goal of saving humanity after a mysterious group of aliens arrives on Earth in the year 2047. But as is obvious, it's not really about that. There is an experience that's broadly shared by all immigrants, but it's one that can, unfortunately so, almost define the lives of Asian people living in the West, and it's one that this game explores in uncompromising detail. 1000 times resist is a story about immigration, about diaspora politics and its clearly undefined boundaries, and the pain and complexity of having a dual national identity. It's about family, the intense, almost biblical connection present across the Asian family unit, how unjustifiably fallible that connection is, and how, despite this, it still manages to carry meaning. It's about the pandemic, in more ways than one. The aliens, the occupants the game refers to them as, bring with them a sickness, causing a rapid expulsion of all bodily fluids through the eyes. Quite literally, people begin crying themselves to death. And it's about memory, in a cultural sense, in a personal sense. It's about experiences, what we bring forward in our lives, and whether or not we have a choice in that. It's about intergenerational trauma, the cycles that we might seem doomed to repeat, even if we can recognize and understand them. 1000 times resist is all of these things simultaneously, but it's also a profoundly personal story of a girl named Iris, the sole daughter of a couple that fled Hong Kong following the brutal 2019 demonstrations, and her struggles of growing up different. Despite its fantastical sci-fi setting, it speaks incredibly honestly to the experience of many Asian families moving to the West, not just to escape immediate turmoil, but for the opportunity to provide for their children, and the burden and the shame that is inextricably linked to it. In this video, I want to explore some of the ways that 1000 times resist encapsulates this experience. Think of this as a bit of analysis mixed with some personal experience thrown in there. I grew up in 2000s Australia, the son of two immigrants. My dad's from Denmark and my mum is from Malaysia. And as you can tell by my very racially ambiguous appearance, I can't really be lumped into an easily defined ethnic group. Even so, it didn't mean that I was entirely safe from the looming threat of good old Australian racism as I was growing up. I tan pretty easily, and when I actually go outside, difficult, I know, I actually tend to look a fair bit darker than I do now, and maybe a little bit more of that Southeast Asian comes through. Point being, I've got this memory. It's something that's almost entirely inconsequential, but in truth, it's never really left me. When I was in high school, I remember being sent to another classroom to deliver something to one of the teachers, and as I walked in, someone sat at the front of the class, looked at me, got the attention of his friend next to him, and then proceeded to do the slanted eyes gesture in reference to me. As you can obviously tell, I don't have epicanthal folds, But it still didn't stop this stereotype being applied to me by people I didn't even know. Look, this might speak more to Australia than racism in general, but you do get the idea. It's no coincidence then that 1000xRESIST's first major area is Iris's high school, reliving memories from her childhood in Canada and her experiences when the occupants, those mysterious alien beings from outer space, pay our dear planet a visit, and a sickness begins to take hold. We live Iris's school life through flashbacks of interactions between her and Zhao, a fresher Chinese immigrant, still with a thick accent, muttering to herself in Mandarin when trying to remember English words. Iris's legacy is Hong Kong. She speaks Cantonese, yet it doesn't stop kids from grouping them together as different. As the sickness spreads, Iris's friends stop eating lunch with her, and Zhao acutely recognizes that it's out of fear. They are afraid of getting sick from people like us. Iris retaliates, "But I was born here. It makes no sense," a cut that Zhao would feel quite keenly. This is quite obviously referencing the treatment of Asian immigrants during the pandemic, but it also showcases a clear divide in the perception of Iris and Zhao's situations from her perspective. Despite experiencing the same cruel treatment for a similar, unfounded reason, Iris insists that the response would make sense in Zhao's case, but not in hers. Zhao is fundamentally alone in a strange land, the epitome of a first-generation immigrant child struggling to adjust to the Western world. She mentions that she watches crime drama with her mother to learn English, and that her dad didn't make it when they fled China. She looks up to Iris, in a lot of ways wants to be just like her, and wants nothing more than to connect over what she perceives as a shared identity, but in some ways doesn't understand that Iris desperately wants to distance herself from that identity. She wants to be like everybody else, and recognizes Zhao as a threat to that endeavor. I often feel this pull within me, a yearning for acceptance. When I think about where I'm from, where I belong, there isn't really a clear-cut and easy answer. I'm not white enough to be fully accepted as Australian, and I'm not Asian enough to be truly accepted back in Malaysia. Let's not even talk about Denmark. This idea of dual identities, not knowing where one really belongs, is a part of that diasporic trauma that's hard to talk about. It's harder to recognize, and it's something that 1000xRESIST homes in on with surgical precision. This identity crisis that is a focal point for many children of immigrant families is often treated with little grace when portrayed in media. Writing for Eurogamer, Alexis Ong describes diaspora politics as untranslatable. Quote, "The psychology at play is a weird chimera that can never be accurately captured in codified language of research and focus groups. The very idea of applying accuracy and objectivity to its study is a joke." It is also not the same repeated anecdote about white kids making fun of a stinky homemade lunch at school, she says. But it is always a mess because the diaspora is chaotic by nature and necessity, end quote. Diaspora is intensely complex and individualistic by its very nature. While people may broadly understand its implication, it's felt entirely separately. Zhao and Iris's inability to actually be there and show up for one another despite their shared experience is a near-perfect encapsulation of this idea. As you're exploring Iris's school, you'll hear murmurings of a rumor about Zhao. This paper-thin relationship, Iris as an able yet unwilling mentor to Zhao, will meet a tragic end. Iris, desperate for the attention and acceptance of her peers in a world where her otherness drives a rift between them, tells everyone something about Zhao. We never get to learn exactly what was said, be it a tender secret or an uncomfortable truth, but its austerity causes Zhao to run away in embarrassment. Iris follows her, and as Zhao opens up about the way that she feels about her, the way that she feels about learning to fit in as someone who is different, an occupant descends on them, and Zhao succumbs to the disease. "I can't be a picture like Dad," she says in her final moments. They must have mistaken the tears for sadness. They must have quickly run out of beds. There is a decoupling of substances and a dangerous gravity. A fundamental part of growing up is learning about the fallibility of your own parents. When you're young, they seem invincible, like they have everything figured out, but you will inevitably hit a point in your life where you learn the truth. In reality, that uncertainty that you feel, the confusion about what your place is in the world, your parents feel the exact same way. They are just as fucked up as we all are, searching for meaning in places where it may not exist, just trying to get by. To some, this feeling can be liberating, and to some, it can be cataclysmic. The family unit in any Asian household is somewhat hard to describe to an outside party. I remember growing up, hearing how some of my white friends would talk to their parents and thinking, man, if I spoke to my mum or my granny like that, there's a very real chance that someone would beat me to death. I described this bond before as almost biblical. There's an almost unbreakable expectation of respect towards people that are older than you in most Asian cultures, oftentimes completely transcending reason. I feel like this is often viewed most explicitly through the idea of sacrifice. 1000xRESIST takes place thousands of years in the future, yet somehow we were reliving Iris's high school life. You see, we actually primarily play as a character named Watcher, one of Iris's clones. With our little floating familiar named Secretary, Watcher can initiate the process of communion with another, where they're able to explore the memories of Iris like they were their own. The second communion takes place in Iris's home, and we learn a lot more about her parents, their relationship, and how Iris views them. This section takes place in 2047, 50 years after the retrocession of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China in 1997. Iris's parents fled to Canada following the student-led demonstrations in 2019, and it's clear they're still deeply affected by it. Iris's dad, referred to only as father or ba, tries incredibly hard to raise Iris with as much grace as he can, given the horrors he experienced in his youth. He's kind, often speaking in metaphor, passing forth moral lessons based on idioms you'd picture Bruce Lee saying word for word. Things always have a way of working themselves out. A little chewing is all it takes. Iris, like many young people growing up in Western society, has decided to no longer eat meat, and thus her dad prepares a meal for them to share. Moodle, he calls it. He says that the bamboo shoots in the soup carry the root of all life's meaning. He speaks much more to the good parts of his time in Hong Kong instead of the violence and suffering. During the darkest days of the demonstrations, it was songs that got us through, he says. The point being, despite the immense suffering, the violence and the pain, he's chosen to look back positively on those memories. He remembers Hong Kong fondly and dreams about returning. Iris's mother is a different story. While she obviously cares deeply for Iris, the pain of the demonstrations, the coldness she experienced from her family, and the stress of uprooting her life to move to the other side of the world results in a very different style of parenting, one that values sacrifice above all else. Iris's mother, adopting an English name, Clara, becomes the family's breadwinner working as a nurse, but retains her cold demeanor towards Iris. Their relationship at first feels very transactional, where Iris is constantly being talked down to, scolded, or berated. There's this idea when talking about diaspora, especially when families sacrifice a lot to provide a better life for their children, that said children must be better than their parents, or the pain and suffering would be for nothing. When reflecting on learning to ride a bike, a painful memory arises, a scraped knee and tears. Clara scolds her. Everyone is watching. You can't show such weakness in front of others. Otherwise, they'll take everything from you. She complains to Ba about Iris sleeping in, leading him to rebuke. Their childhood was so traumatic, fighting police in the streets of Hong Kong, seeing their friends beaten, being beaten themselves. Iris should have it better. He says quietly, "If Mui Mui wants to sleep, I think we let her sleep." It's these competing mindsets, both a direct result of their upbringing and their diasporic trauma, that when Iris does lash out, Clara feels betrayed, isolated. She finds solace talking to Zhao. We see them connect over their struggle to fit in a society that they ultimately do not belong to, reminiscing of home, regardless of whether or not that place even exists anymore. There is a broader point in all of this. Despite the dysfunction of a family unit that moves into a culture that doesn't share the same value structure, the harsh, rigidly defined lines of hierarchy, respect, and loyalty, there is still something there, however unjustifiable it may seem. The ties that bind often transcend reason, and the diasporic experience only solidifies those binds, no matter how unreasonable they may be. When I was much younger, I once had a friend tell me that you choose your family, implying that friends or those close to you could be considered family in the same way. And while I broadly get what they mean by that, the idea of rejecting those bound to you by blood for something as simple as how they treat you seems so foreign. It's parents, it's children, born here or not, that make up that unmistakably Asian family unit, and it's explored with such grace in 1000xRESIST that I would say that the game is worth experiencing just for that aspect of it. Iris, a second-generation immigrant, adopted the culture of her home over that of her parents. This strained relationship that Iris shares with her mother is obviously a direct result of this. Differing cultural values, and the very understandable inability of Clara to let go of her pain. This rift that forms between them is obvious, so when the government shows up at their door, suggesting that Iris's immunity to the disease that is sweeping the world might be the key to saving humanity, she jumps at the opportunity to leave. There is a you and an us, and a means to us. There is a choice, and we will not make it. My granny used to speak of the war. She spoke of a childhood, innocent years lost to the occupation of Malaysia by, at the time, the fascist wing of Imperial Japan. She spoke of brutality, streets adorned by impaled heads as the invaders raided houses and businesses for supplies to fuel their bloody conquest. She spoke of an event, an act of cruelty so inexplicable that it could have changed the course of her life in an instant, were it not for the choice of another. More on this in a bit. And she spoke of leaving Malaysia for a better future some years later. Iris's parents fled Hong Kong in the hope of starting anew, a story that draws deep parallels to one entrenched in the collective psyche of many immigrants, fleeing war or poverty with the express purpose of providing a better life for their children. 1000xRESIST imagines a world where Hong Kong is wholly absorbed by China following what the game describes as a failure of the 2019 demonstrations. The reason Clara and Ba fled in the first place. There's this scene in chapter 2 where we see the two talking to Clara's mother before they board the plane to leave. All this fighting, the demonstrations, her mother sees this as nothing more than a nuisance, and that Hong Kong will thrive if they just lay down their arms and accept the injustice. She disapproves of Ba, believing that he is pulling her into danger by standing up for what they believe in. As they prepare to leave, Clara's mother says something that will define her forever. "No more worrying for me. Once you leave us, I'll finally sleep at night." "Good," Clara responds coldly. And despite this harsh treatment, she still calls. She makes sure her mother is taking her medicine, making sure she is well, but no matter how hard she tries to hide them, the scars, they remain and remain and remain. She sleepwalks at night, unwillingly submitting herself to the painful memories of the demonstrations, the cruelty of her mother, and the stress of raising a family in an unfamiliar land. It's no coincidence then that Iris, some untold time later in the government facility, the orchard, that is her new home, begins to do the same, haunted by memories of Hong Kong, her parents, their parents. This is clearly PTSD, although you might not immediately recognize it as such, and another allegory for intergenerational trauma, though perhaps a little more overt than in real life, for the sake of making a point. It's about cycles, ones that are intrinsic to the diasporic experience. Clara's mother sees her daughter as a fool for leaving, all but disowning her, and despite the immense emotional strain this places on her, when Iris is offered a chance to leave with the hope of saving the fucking world, Clara commits the very same sin. And thus, Iris befalls an identical fate. The cycle is doomed to repeat. There is a you, and it has a pattern we are looking at. Political unrest, war, and turmoil is inextricably linked to the exodus of Asian people from their homeland. I hear countless stories from Asian friends of mine, their parents fleeing the war in Vietnam, braving the oceans on a rickety boat with the minuscule hope of refuge, to my own family, deeply scarred by the aftermath of World War II. I suppose I'll tell you what happened to my granny back in the war. As the Japanese raided houses in KL, they took a special interest in rooting out individuals that they thought might be British or foreign in general. You see, Japan believed in the idea of co-prosperity, that they could unite all of Asia under one rule, leading to a land free of Western colonialism. The only problem is that the Japanese military was willing to do almost anything to make that happen. My great-grandmother was quite a fair-skinned woman, as was my granny, despite their Malay heritage. So when the Japanese military came through, with the purpose of rooting out the foreign influence, seeing a paler woman, they immediately assumed she was British or Portuguese or something. So what did they do? With everyone in the house watching, they knelt my great-grandmother down, and were it not for a higher-ranking officer noticing her pregnancy, they would have beheaded her on the spot. My granny would have been around 8 years old when this happened, and she spoke of it on her deathbed. To think, one action could have inextricably changed the course of her life. It's almost certain that I wouldn't even exist to be telling this story today, and the trauma that she carried with her dictated so much of her being. 1000xRESIST understands this trauma, not only through its direct reference to the Hong Kong demonstrations, but through a parallel sequence later in the game. Watcher is eventually captured, interrogated, and tortured for years after killing the original Iris. I know, it's a lot to follow. And what eventually forms in the society outside is a pseudo-fascistic government, complete with its very own militarized police force. What I want to highlight, however, is what happens through this torment. Watcher begins to have flashbacks to not just Iris's life, but to the Hong Kong demonstrations, to the aftermath of Iris leaving her family, and to her pained life in the orchard as All-Mother, in a world comprised entirely of copies of herself. We see a video recording of Ba talking directly to Iris were she ever to return, discussing his fears, regrets, expectations as a father. He spoke of 2019, the brutality he and his family faced at the hands of the police in HK. "I'm not strong like you," he says. "These sounds, him screaming, my skull cracking. Do you know why I used to sing all the time?" He says that while they dragged his brother away, he shouted back, "I won't kill myself," and questions what could possibly lead someone to even suggest something like that. Iris's mother, sitting alone with Ba in her apartment after Iris left them, low on supplies as the world is slowly succumbing to the disease, reflects on the 2019 demonstrations. She says that she regrets leaving and questions the point in all of that suffering if it eventuated to nothing. All it did was expedite the end, she says, with Hong Kong eventually being absorbed by the People's Republic of China. It wasn't just about winning, Iris's father says in protest. "You remember, in the streets, hundreds of thousands marching shoulder to shoulder, biggest demonstrations in HK history. The world watched it all happen, heard our voices, saw us bleed. If we stayed silent, didn't stand up for ourselves, they would say, this is how it always was. They would say, this is what the people wanted. But no, they can't say that because it's gone down in history that we resisted fiercely, that we fought for a different future until we couldn't. Resistance is almost inherent within diaspora, and this can take many forms. Resistance against authority, the Hong Kongers standing for their future, despite their defeat seeming almost inevitable. The power struggle of the clones when faced with their pseudo-authoritarian government, despite living lives that some might deem comfortable. Leaving one's homeland can be read as an act of defiance in itself, and Iris resists against many things. She resists against governmental control when trapped in the orchard with people that treat her as nothing more than a lab rat. But this inherent fight within her leads to a lot of pain for herself and those around her. She resists against her culture. She resists against her parents, despite them having the best intentions for her. And I think there's a lot to be said in that. Iris's dad addresses that one more time. When you were growing up, there was this rage inside of you that would burst out from time to time. I couldn't understand why. We tried to give you everything we didn't have. Maybe you felt the same way I did, waking up one day on the wrong side of the wrong bed and living the rest of your life that way, like wrong ingredients in a soup. It smells right, it looks right, but in the stomach, it's bitter. I thought I could give you a life without such bitterness. But isn't this just the way? We do not get to choose what we inherit. The question is, where does this anger come from? Is it an inherent part of that connection to Hong Kong? Iris does resent her parents for leaving to some degree. Is it from her family? Is it a direct result of Clara's trauma that she experienced from her mother and how it led her to raise Iris in a very utilitarian manner, wishing the best for her but resenting her when she doesn't have the drive that's expected of her? Does it come from growing up in a culture that never really accepted her as one of their own? The pain, the bullying, the expectations placed on her through Zhao and her parents. I would argue that it's all of those things, and that Iris's ability to move forward fundamentally hinges on her ability to accept that and carry with it what she will. 1000xRESIST, whilst ostensibly dealing with memory, the pandemic, authoritarianism, and a plethora of other things, fundamentally is about diaspora politics in a way that I don't think I've seen a piece of media try to tackle outside of perhaps Everything Everywhere All at Once. As such, I'm not sure just how well these ideas will translate to an outside party, as they're seemingly fundamental to an experience, one of struggle, trauma, and ostracism, and I believe that it's at least tangentially inherent to all immigrants from Asia, leaving everything they know to provide a better life for future generations. Its ideas are messy, not entirely clear-cut and chaotic. They're painful and not fully definable. As such is the diasporic experience that I hope I was at least somewhat able to communicate to you in this video. So, back to that question. What does it mean to leave one's homeland? Well, I think it's broadly about opening yourself up to risk, to heartache, and to suffering, but crucially, it's also about moving forward, despite the pain that one may inevitably cause by doing so. Time for the obligatory arcane quote, sometimes taking a leap forward means leaving a few things behind. At the end of the day, this game is really special, and even if you think a walking sim might not be for you, I'm almost certain that you'll find something you'll click with here. As for me, I think I found this game at the exact moment in which I needed it, and it had such a profound effect on me that I had to make this video talking about it. So, if you enjoyed it, let me know. So I'll leave you there. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic day.